So the first one being routine exercise.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I think that drew me to this, so I've always been an athlete, but what I noticed is that I'm a psychologist by training, but during my training in psychology, most of the focus was on diagnostics and assessment and then therapeutics. But therapeutics was more like, we can call it conventional psychotherapy. So people may be familiar with things like cognitive behavioral therapy or dialectical behavioral therapy or ACT. There's a lot of different modalities for that. What we didn't address as much was the role that movement and exercise plays in mental health. And I find that fascinating because if you were to go on to PubMed or to go on to really any research database and begin to look at modifiable behaviors that can significantly move the needle in terms of mental well-being, at the very top of the list, above psychotherapy, above nutrition, above just about everything. There's only one other competing thing that I'll talk about here in a second that's pretty on par with this one, is exercise. Exercise constantly comes up. Why is that? Well, we know that movement of the body is training in the brain. So as we move the body, and that could be strength training, that could be cardiovascular training, as we engage in mobilizing energy, we know that this stimulates our central nervous system, so our brain and our spinal cord, to help to build more neuronal connections, to help with what's called neurogenesis, which is the neuronal connections. And then also it creates and stimulates something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is like Miracle-Gro for the brain. All of these things can be so helpful also in balancing some of the neurotransmitters that are associated with emotional and mental dysregulation. And I don't think that neurotransmitters are just the core of mental illness and mental wellness. However, we do know that they are a variable. So we know that we can enhance their functionality with movement and with exercise. So as a part of the routine that I provide as a clinician, that we kind of teach with my company at Hanu, is that exercise has to be a foundational pillar to what you're doing, because the evidence is just so robust as to how exercise plays a vital role in overall mental well-being.
Yeah, like why do you think it's taken so long for that to be like, maybe I'm wrong, but maybe I feel like it's taken a long time for the movement, the exercise and the body to become interconnected with the mind piece. I think for a long time, maybe people only thought psychological distress happened in the brain and you fix the mind with the mind. Um, and I just, for me personally, that's just never been the case. Like every time I feel anxious or stressed, it's always been an exercise, because I've been an athlete my whole life, like you. So that's always been like sort of my foundational piece.
Right.
Um, and now it's like, for me, it just feels like there's no other option. You just have to move. You have
Yeah.
to.
Yeah.
Like otherwise life is just not as good as it potentially might be. And I think people also get caught up on like, oh, do I have to lift weights? No, you absolutely don't have to lift weights. You should, because that's a great marker for health span.
Mm-hmm.
But you can do Zumba or dance or rock climb or do jujitsu or all of these things. You just got to find something that you actually want to stick to and that you enjoy doing, even though it sometimes sucks.
Right. Any movement is better than no movement, for sure. I would, to come back to your question, I think one of the primary reasons it took so long is because of what you mentioned before. People were in camps, and scientists and academics are the ones. So if people aren't familiar with with how this works, is that academics drive the research that informs the therapy provided by the clinician.
Mm.
And because of that, clinicians are waiting to hear from the researchers as to what to do in order to move the needle. So in our discussion in mental health, we're talking about how do we move the needle from a mental health perspective. If we're waiting on these researchers, we're typically looking for people who are doing research in that field. So for exercise physiologists, they're looking to exercise physiologists. For psychologists, they're looking for psychological researchers. And so a lot of the times, especially in the fields of psychological research and mental health research, a lot of it had to do with different therapeutic modalities or different theoretical models. And we weren't really looking at health behavior change. When we knew that when someone was depressed or anxious, they were much less likely to exercise. We knew that they were much less likely to make appropriate nutritional decisions. We know that they were likely having sleep related issues. So we kind of always looked back like prospectively or retrospectively. And what we needed to do is look forward and say, okay, well, how can we actually use some of these tools preventatively? And so
Mhm.
it wasn't it wasn't until I would say more or less like the last like 20 or so years that we really came into this idea that, okay, the mind and the body are not two completely disconnected entities here, right? Like these are actually much more interconnected. They're a bidirectional street. Once one communicates one way, the other can communicate the other way as well. So it's two-way communication. I think that for psychologists, there was this resistance to saying, and I put mental health into psychologists as well. Am a psychologist, so I kind of speak for the masses of psychologists, which I probably shouldn't, but I'm going to anyway. uh, what I would say for us is we're like, okay, well, we're trained in this modality. That is the lens that we view this from. It is our life's work to engage in the activities that we've been trained in, and so we kind of avoided looking into these other pathways. And then I think we had this kind of clear knock at the door saying, like, well, what is the actual thing that we're trying to do as mental health professionals? Oh yeah, help people improve mental well-being. If that is the case, and that is the platform that we're running on, then shouldn't we not leave any stone unturned here? Like we should
Mhm.
explore everything. And I think the openness to holistic and integrative medicine and integrative health has been the key driver and catalyst to having us look at these other approaches like nutrition and exercise and sleep and how they are interconnected with mental well-being and how the mind and the body are not just these two completely separated entities.